Many of you may have noticed my sermon title, Love Actually, may recognize that comes from a rather popular movie these days. Who has seen Love Actually? Well, not even half. That's interesting. So it's become a much more popular movie. It's from Britain. It occurs during Christmas time. In fact, it's kind of become more and more the Christmas movie to watch during the Christmas season. And it's a story that tells many different stories of different kinds of love and many different kinds of people. It is for grown-ups, I'll warn you that. But it is a really funny, engaging movie to watch. But my favorite part of this movie is the opening credits and the closing credits. And that sounds strange, but the opening credits are real-life filming at an airport of people waiting for people as they come off an airplane. And it shows people of all ages, old and young, all ethnicities, and as people come off the plane, as they go to greet them embracing them, tears of joy. It's an interesting montage of all these real-life images of this kind of experience of love. And the opening credits has a narrator, Hugh Grant, who says this during the opening lines. He says, "Whenever I get gloomy with the state of the world, I think about the arrivals gate at Heathrow Airport. General opinion's starting to make out that we live in a world of hatred and greed. But I don't see that. It seems to me that love is everywhere. Often it's not particularly dignified or newsworthy, but it's always there. Fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, husbands and wives, boyfriends, girlfriends, old friends. When the planes hit the Twin Towers, as far as I know, none of the phone calls from the people on board were messages of hate or revenge. They were all messages of love. If you look for it, I've got a sneaky feeling you'll find that love actually is all around. Love actually is all around." Now, I don't know about you, but I love that message. These days, it sometimes feels so full of hatred and greed and anger, that love actually is all around. And what does that really, really mean? The passage I read this morning, we've all heard it. It's been a passage read over and over again, understandably so. Passage read over and over. Who has heard this passage read at a wedding? I'd be surprised if it wasn't 100% of you. And it is an amazing passage. I'll confess to you, Paul, who wrote this passage, Paul, who basically kind of formed the theological backbone of our Christian faith, who had these theologically dense ideas of justification by faith and who could explain sin and salvation in such a way that you fall asleep within 5 minutes. I have found when reading Paul that I think more often than not he is a bore. Now, I know you're not supposed to hear that from your preacher. But then there are the passages like this. Amazing, musical, mystical passages that he writes that are amazing. And so it's understandable why this passage is read at weddings. But the truth be known, that's unfortunate. Because while it might be helpful for a couple to reflect on love in this way, really what Paul is trying to communicate is far more than love between two people. He is actually making a profound theological insight about who God is and who Jesus was and who we're supposed to be. And if we just relegate it to weddings, we're missing its point. Now, here's a test. I'm going to see how many of you in your many years of being in church, I'm sure some of you have heard sermons on the 3 kinds of love in the Bible. Let's see if you can name those 3. I know the tongue's sticking out. It's like, oh my God, this again. But let's see who remembers. The one kind of love is what? Philia. Love of brother, sister, a kind of family love, a friendship love, very meaningful love. What's another one? Agape, y'all all know that. We'll get to that. What's the other one? Does anybody remember? Eros, that's right. Physical love, sexual love. And all are very important. Paul would affirm those 2 are very important aspects of love. But the word for love in this passage, the Greek word, is agape. And many of us may have heard that word, but don't really fully grasp what's expressed in that kind of love. And it's a key kind of love for Paul to understand who God is and who we're supposed to be and who Jesus embodied who God was. Agape is a love so focused on the other that it has no concern necessarily with the self. It is a love that is so extended to the other, it has nothing to do with our own self. Now, I do this sometimes in weddings. When I do weddings, I'll share with the couple. I'll say to them, here you're at this point, you're falling in love, which is a kind of form of psychosis, I basically believe, being in love in a way. And it's a good thing, it's a joyous thing, it's great to be romantically in love. But I tell them, I promise, and I know they don't want to hear this, I promise there'll be a day when they're laying in bed and they're looking over at their partner, they're snoring away. And I point out, there will be a day when you notice all the dirty clothes, the bathroom floor. There will be a day when all the dishes were left by your partner in the sink, and it just ticks you off, and there's very little feeling of love. All of us who are married know those days. But agape is the truth, we still love them, even though we don't really like them. And for Paul, agape, this kind of love that flows from God into our hearts, it flows from a place not of our own sense of selves, but truly committed to the other. And that's the radical nature of who God is. You could put, and I have done this as an exercise, you could read this text and say, God is patient. God is kind. God isn't jealous. God doesn't brag. God isn't arrogant. God isn't rude. God doesn't seek God's own advantage. God isn't irritable. God doesn't keep a record of complaints. God isn't happy with injustice. But God is happy with truth. God puts up with all things. God trusts in all things. God hopes for all things. God endures all things. God never fails. In other words, what's hard for us to grasp is it's very hard to see it in this world, is that God is this kind of love that gave us grace, this kind of embrace that came not because God needed us to God, love them, but simply out of the abundance of God's love for us. Now, that idea is actually so radical that we have messed with it so much in the church. We think of spiritual life. Well, I love God. God saves me, right? Keeps me out of hell insurance, gets me into heaven. Or we'll even say, well, God saves those because God is shaped by some sense that God needs to save us. But really the truth, the radical nature of the agape of God's love is that it is a gift, unmerited, unearned, and simply comes. Not because it serves God, but because that love serves others. Now, that sounds like a simple idea, but it is extremely radical in today's world. That Jesus embodied, incarnated agape. A love, not that he wanted something from someone, but simply a gift of loving other people, especially those others that people couldn't love. And so if we are a reflection of that kind of agape as a community, then we are called to love that person sitting next to you in the pew, not for what they do for you, but simply out of the abundance of God. Now, a church member gave me a gift for Christmas, a book by one of my favorite writers, David Brooks. Does anybody know who David Brooks? He writes for the New York Times. He writes from a more conservative perspective, so there are some things I often struggle with and think differently about, but he is this most amazing writer, and he wrote this book called The Second Mountain. And in this book, he says, we spend our lives trying to climb the first mountain. And the first mountain we climb, essentially, is our careers, our families, that we spend our lives, trying to build these careers and be successful and find our partner and be married and raise our kids. And that's a good mountain to climb. It's an important mountain in our lives. It helps us feel successful. But he says the most important mountain that often we don't even address until we've gotten through that first mountain is the second mountain, which for him is finding our true calling of what it means to be a human being. And that means to make a commitment to love others. Not for what it does for us, but simply out of a summons from something larger than ourselves. His argument is that we live in a culture that has been incredibly sick, narcissistic, so focused on the individual and self. We see that in church. More often than not, when we talk about salvation, it's not about the whole world or the whole creation, it's about our individual soul. And his point is that we live in a culture in which we have made it so much about the individual success and happiness that we have lost the essence of the second mountain. And you don't climb the second mountain, you get kind of summoned to it. You realize there are others out there in need. You realize there are others who need your care, not for what it does for you, but simply out of their need. And the profound truth he asserts is if we are lucky enough to ascend that second mountain, to find those commitments in our lives in which we're called to something larger than ourselves, whether that's church, working for something, justice or compassion or peace in the world, if we're lucky enough to find ourselves summoned to that second mountain, we find something profoundly joyous. He says the most joyful people he knows live on that second mountain. So early on in the life of the church, the first years of the life of the church, first 100 years or first couple of 100 years, as these communities of followers of Jesus began to form and take shape and began to worship, they got a lot of criticism and persecution from many in the culture around them, and attacks on them for various reasons. Many were threatened by this new belief system. But there were two things that critics observed about these early Christian communities. Two things that they saw as, well, rather meaningful about these early Christians, these early people who called themselves and lived in these communities. They noticed, one thing they noticed was how they cared for the poor. In an empire, in a civilization that there was no safety net, they noticed these small pockets of followers of Jesus who loved the poor. And the second thing that over and over critics said about these Christians, these followers of Jesus, what they said was, see how they love each other. They were awed by the love in these communities, by the agape. Now, my prayer for us is that we embody that kind of love with each other, with those around us, with our strangers we meet in the street, not because it does something for us as a church, because it brings people or whatever. We simply do it because agape fills our hearts. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.